Tale Foundry. Hey there, welcome back. So last week we released our first Dark Souls video, which got, kind of cerebral. We ended up using a lot of technical writing terminology, just to tell you about how we think Dark Souls approaches storytelling. But in this video, we want to show you how it does that instead. And, oh man, there is a lot to show. These games use a ridiculous number of tricks to convey their story. It's crazy. But because we're such clever machines, we've sort of managed to whittle it all down into a few different methods. So here are what we believe to be the 6 key elements of Dark Souls lore. After loading up the first game, clicking through the title screen, and creating your character, the first thing you see in the entire Dark Souls series is a cinematic. This infamous opener, as well as the openers in the other 2 games, is really the only one that gives you any actual narrative direction. All the others are pretty utilitarian, used more to orient the player within the game world, or to add a theatrical flourish to an introduction. So, weirdly, this is less about the cinematics that are in the games and more about the ones that aren't. The Dark Souls games are some of the few that really take advantage of video games as a storytelling medium. Instead of just telling the story through visuals and audio, like film or most other games, they let players discover the story by playing the games. Even if you aren't playing the games for the lore, if you ignore the opening cinematics and rush through without stopping to investigate anything, you'll probably find yourself picking up on aspects of the story anyway, just by moving through the world. In fact, because of how thoroughly the lore is baked into the setting, it's pretty hard not to start piecing things together. For example, in one area, you find yourself traversing the ruins of a flooded city populated by ghosts. Not hard to guess what sort of tragedy occurred here. Of course, if you want to dig for it, the actual story goes a lot deeper, but you don't have to. The gist of it is right there in front of you. In another area, the Kiln of the First Flame, you fight in an ashy landscape littered with abandoned swords. It really doesn't take much to conclude that they most likely belong to other warriors who tried to walk your path and failed. Pretty much the entire game world is designed in this way. There are very few, if any, arbitrary set pieces, and so, without the need for text or voiceovers to explain what you're looking at, you're able to gain impressions about the world and its history. That in itself is a potent form of storytelling. Often, we discuss gameplay and story as if they're 2 different things, and for the vast majority of games, they sort of are. The story just serves as an additional aesthetic element, a pretty skin to overlay the mechanics, and incentive to play through otherwise dull sections. But in Dark Souls, the story is so integral to the experience that it bleeds into the very systems that the gameplay is built around. You don't gather experience in gold, you gather the souls of your enemies, a process that both conveys the narrative and works as a compelling game mechanic. The series is overflowing with this kind of symbolic, story-related gameplay. You don't lose lives, you're an immortal being who loses humanity. You don't manually save your game, you rest at a bonfire. Even the more esoteric, specific parts of gameplay, the behavior of enemies, the attributes and effects of items, even those hint at the lore in some way. Whether you're aware of it or not, the games are exposing you to their stories all the time. As you hack, slash, and die your way through the brutal world of Dark Souls, you'll begin to notice that you aren't quite alone in your struggle. There are characters scattered throughout the games, all caught up in their own, equally depressing, stories. What's really strange, though, is that, with the exception of a small handful of them, these characters aren't there for you. They have their own agendas and plot arcs entirely independent of yours, which you can become involved in if you want to. It's not mandatory. In fact, if you're that special kind of sociopath who likes to massacre all the characters in games, you can off pretty much every character you come across in these games, bringing their stories to an end. Although I wouldn't recommend it, because as you interact with them and learn about their stories, you gain valuable insight into your own. Aside from the opening cinematics and a bit of dialogue from some of the more forthright characters, the only direct narrative you get in the games comes in a very strange package, something a lot of players probably gloss over their first time through. Every item you find comes with a description. Exciting, huh? Look at that, dripping with lore. But a lot of the items do contain pieces of actual narrative, or at the very least, some kind of contextualization. Often you'll kill an enemy, pillage its corpse, and find a new item with a description that reveals something about the enemy, the area, the history, or the story in general that you would have never otherwise known. Some may consider this sloppy storytelling a failure to present the story in a clear and forthright way, requiring too much from the audience. But the final point on this list makes a pretty compelling argument for this as one of the best ways to tell a story in games. The culmination of all the things we've talked about so far, the lack of exposition through cinematics and the context clues seeded throughout just about every part of the games, creates a storytelling experience which depends less on the writer's delivery and more on the audience's engagement. And, you know, this unconventional approach really seems to be working. As they've played the game and uncovered pieces of lore, players have come together to share their findings, allowing a community of sleuths and storytellers to blossom around the series. It's actually become such an undertaking that some have created entire shows about exploring the games and decoding their lore. Channels like Dave Control, Epic Namebro, and perhaps the most prominent of the Dark Souls lore aficionados, VadiVidya. They combine their own experiences and theories with those posited by the community at large in order to create and deliver cohesive narratives based around the hints supplied by the games. In fewer words, we have fans creating the story for the game they love. There's something kind of magical about that, isn't there? I mean, that's why in this month's first video, we went so far as to create an entirely new term to describe how Dark Souls tells its stories. This idea of confluent narrative is one of the few ways we've seen for the writer to pass the torch of storytelling to their audience. Of course, it works particularly well in games, but we think it also has application in other mediums. And so, for this month's short story, that's what we'll be trying to create. Something that makes use of this concept without just riffing on Dark Souls' story. Anyway, thanks for watching, and keep making stuff up. We'll see you next week. Bye!